Hello everyone, good to see you all again, and welcome back to the second part of our War of Independence section. And today what I'm going to talk about is some general things about the shape or the character of this conflict, and just make some kind of general points about how it develops, and how it changes, and just to get a general kind of lay the sort of background scenery, as it were, for this conflict, which we're going to talk in more detail about in later lectures. One of the big problems, of course, you've got with a conflict like this is what do you call it? And you'll notice that in Northern Ireland recently, of course, calling what's happened from 1969 to 1998 in Northern Ireland, calling it the Troubles. What does that mean? Really, what does that mean? It's a very Irish way, and this is what happens a lot in Ireland, of avoiding having to define things. And so call it the Troubles is kind of safe. And this definition problem is ongoing. I mean, here we go. Here's one of the big issues. The names it goes through this conflict. The Tan War was what it used to be called for many, many years, as in the war against the Black and Tans. That would be the traditional name, as it were, before historians got involved in this. That doesn't work. Mainly because the Black and Tans, there's not many Black and Tans actually in Ireland. There's only about 5,000 of them. There's lots of other people fighting other people in different groups and so on. So it isn't really as clear cut as that. The Troubles, again, as I say, what does that even mean? The Anglo-Irish War, that became kind of more popular. I say that was the early name given to it by historians. Again, doesn't really work because it's not really an Anglo-Irish war. This has more of the look of a kind of war of a sort of civil war in many ways. When you think about it, because most people who are fighting on both sides of this war are Irish, and that's important. The Black and Tans, are loads of Irish people in it. You just remember that. In the films, of course, they all have these industrial Cockney accents and stuff. They always give them a Cockney accent. That makes them more English than anything. They're not even Scottish. It was make them really kind of English, so they can kick in doors and be all abusive and so on. But that isn't really the case of at all. There's Canadian Black and Tans and all kind of people involved in this. And I say the RIC are Irish, the IRA are Irish. So it does have a kind of, you could call this a civil war, and some people have called it a civil war, an ongoing sort of civil war right throughout this period. You could think of this maybe as a war of colonial liberation, if you want to think of it that way. That's it's kind of akin to other kind of, you think about colonial wars, in imperial colonies and so on, in Africa and so on. Yeah, it's kind of similar to that, I suppose. We've settled now, as I say, on this phrase, the War of Independence, which is, I think it does the job. It's a very anemic phrase, though. I think it's not very exciting. And again, there are huge problems in terms of that, because of course it leaves out the North. In terms of, the War of Independence is not really a thing in the North. The North has a different story. You have to find sort of something that's some kind of definition that's an Irish definition that encompasses all of Ireland, all of its experience, as it were, in this period. And I say, I don't think War of Independence really worked. It's a very southern nationalist kind of perspective on all of this, as is so much, as we've said. But anyway, so that's just to mention it. We don't have to worry too much about that, but just bear these kind of things in mind as we kind of go through. Now, even the start date for this is kind of, has this kind of deceptive clarity, which doesn't really exist in the post-rising period. So the 21st of January, the start date of the war in 1919, it's not really the case. It's just very convenient, as I say, as a date, because it's the meeting of the Dáil and this shooting, and we'll say that's kind of the start of this. Yeah. But what had actually happened, the reality is, since the release, of course, of the volunteers in late 1916, if you remember, they'd made constant attempts to reinvigorate the movement. And this had led already to inevitable confrontation in local areas. And I'll just show you some of these images here as we go through of these little local IRA kind of groups. I'll give you an example. As early as February 1918, the British had placed County Clare under martial law. So that doesn't suggest some big change that happens in January 1919. Already, this kind of low level, bubbling away violence is happening in some places more than others. So again, it's a very, very great. You think of this period really as a sort of 1916 right through until 1921. It's just this kind of low level and steadily escalating kind of conflict. And what you often get is, and one reason you get confrontation most importantly, is not so much there's an IRA campaign, because remember what the IRA are thinking is there's going to be another rising. There is going to be a big date, as there has been in 1916. We're going to have another go, and this time we'll be ready. And well, yeah, so there's going to be a magic date, as it were, whatever, Easter maybe, Easter 1919 or something. They never actually do end up with a rising, of course, but it's going to be a nationwide kind of attempt. That's going to be better than the original one. We're going to avenge what happened in 1916. And what you get with confrontation-wise, therefore, is the IRA, as the volunteers, they're still the volunteers at this point. They will become the IRA early in this conflict. They carry out various raids and things for arms. This is what they're mainly trying to do, because they're very short on weapons. So what tends to happen in local areas is a few of the more progressive guys who really want to get this thing going, they'll hear that there's some guy up in an isolated farm maybe who's got a revolver. Maybe he brought it back from the war, or someone's got a shotgun or something. And they'll often go up there and, try and ask for, we want the gun. And usually they'll hand it over. Sometimes they won't. And then you'll get a smack in the mouth, or, maybe a shot's fired here and there. So that kind of leads to confrontation. Small isolated police barracks. You try and break in there and steal their weapons. So it's all about securing weapons for the future rising coming forward. And that's how kind of organically this kind of conflict kind of grows in the provinces. So there's not really any great difference between what's happening before Solihull Beg and what happens after. It's the same kind of, disorder and low-level violence that you kind of get. And again, I'll show you some of these images. You've got these wonderful coloured images now of many of these old photographs, which are just absolutely fantastic. And you remember the volunteers themselves, despite being drawn in, as we said, to supporting these political campaigns with Sinn Féin and travelling around the country and so on as the grassroots movement, they'd remained an absolutely unreconstructed militarist movement. And in provincial areas, they're training now, preparing, gathering themselves, getting their weapons ready for the big time, the big extensive rising that's going to come. And as such, they don't really take a great deal of notice at the kind of new subtleties, political subtleties, and the political dynamics that are going on and what it all implies. No, it's all part of the general movement. We're happy to support anything, really, which is what they are, that's going to, weaken British rule in Ireland. But ultimately, it's going to be a war. And there'd been little kind of coherent development. I suppose in the same way the political side develops, we talk about this huge revolution in terms of the political side, creation of this thing called Sinn Féin and so on. Really goes on a huge journey after the rising. Don't really get that with the volunteers. They stay exactly the kind of same now as they've always been. And that's going to be a kind of problem. They've got their own, as it were, timeline, own agenda. That's how they see this confrontation coming. And politics is not really a key part of this. There is a GHQ in Dublin, rather akin to the volunteer GHQ before the Easter Rising. But they're only really nominally in charge of these volunteers. I mean, if you do ever go to, or maybe if you ever go to UCD archives and look, you've got all these papers, the Mulcahy papers, which are all from GHQ. Mulcahy's the chief of staff in Dublin. And reading them, you'd imagine he's like Napoleon or something, really. It's pages and pages of, sending out orders to all these provincial units, telling them what to do. And you think, oh, this is the centre of the spider's web here. This is the headquarters that are organising this war. Absolutely not at all. Most of them, they don't really just ignore him. And what often you get with GHQ, as we'll see, is they often follow developments on the ground. So it's often the IRA in the provinces who lead the way, as it were, with GHQ then following afterwards, and then afterwards issuing orders and so on, after the fact to other provincial units to follow the lead of, as it were, maybe the more radical elements in Munster or whatever. So there isn't, this localism and so on is incredibly important. And we do have to think of the IRA in this period as, I say, made up of these kind of warlord figures, which again is not, we're not trying to, make any kind of, ethical kind of judgment. But if you want to get a sense of the shape of the organization, in South Tipperary, there's a group of guys, and they're the guys, Dan Breen, Sean Tracy, you was a Longford, Sean McKeon's your man, him and his gang, and then lots of others around that. He's your top banana. As it were. In Cork, of course, there's loads of them. There's Liam Deasy and Liam Mellows and Tom Barry and, there's Joe Sweeney and Donegal and so on. These are the key kind of figures in all of this. So we just show you some of these. I say these images are pretty impressive. So what you get is, I say, as this happened before the Rising, very close-knit groups of young men from these small communities, know their local area, often with strong personal and family links. You get a lot of brothers joined together, for example. Often, as we said, as happened before, isn't that amazing? How they coloured that image. Often, as we said before, it will be the local hurling team or something, or the Gaelic football team. This is the young men, as it were, of the village, coming together, and they'll easily morph into an IRA company or whatever, and they all know each other. Officers are elected initially, and usually, I say, due to their status in the Gaelic sporting or cultural organisation, it's quite odd, really. So it's the guy who's the captain of the Gaelic football team will often be elected, because he's a leader, as it were, the captain, and he'll be kind of elected as the leader of the little volunteer company. Many of them, of course, have no idea what they're doing militarily. They're not military leaders, and so. Here's a wonderful quote from Florrie O'Donoghue from Cork, and he recalls about these sort of officers being elected, and he says they tended to put the plausible talker rather than the capable worker in positions of authority. Yeah, you can imagine that happening. So the IRA is going to have to go in this journey as well. The kind of rise in militancy that you get is going to be a kind of organic process. And a kind of revolutionary meritocracy is going to develop. So it's not going to be bureaucratic initiative, as in, GHQ will appoint him, and him. It doesn't work like that. GHQ isn't directing this at all, even though they might think they are. And what often happens, it's horrible to say this, but the reality is, you can imagine, it tends to be the guys who are prepared to do the dirtiest work, if you like. It's the people who are prepared to kill. A lot of people aren't prepared to do that. But it's the guy they're the ones who are going to rise in the ranks. That's how you earn your badge of honour, as it were, and become an officer or a leader in the IRA. So I say it's an organic, meritocratic, revolutionary kind of process. And I say, when you talk about Sol Hedberg, and I mentioned this at the end of the last lecture, I think it is a kind of sign of frustration from the volunteers, from the militarists. Rather than the kind of starting gun, as it were, for a full outbreak of hostilities, I think they're just getting increasingly frustrated and, as I say, suspicious of this political side of the movement, which is drawing all the money and all the publicity and so on. And, their dominance is, of course, both a diversion from the militaristic legacy of the Rising. The Rising is a military endeavour. Absolutely. This is what we said right at the start. This is a military solution to a political problem. They're going to carry on doing that. And they also see it, of course, as, politics is, you're going to end up compromising somehow. Eventually, that's where it's going to lead. And you'll compromise on the sacred purity of the separatist demand now, which, these people died for in the Rising and so on. So I say they're very suspicious of this. And, like Sol Hedberg, you can kind of make a comparison with the Easter Rising in the sense that it's a small group of radicals who are going to push the movement, as it were, forward into violent confrontation. So it's these kind of people, by doing these killings and so on, they're going to embolden the movement, push it over the threshold now. And I say that will eventually morph now into full-scale kind of guerrilla war. And of course, what's going to happen in this conflict is it's these people here on the screen, not the people talking in the Mansion House with all their, their proclamations to the world's press. They're not going to be the ones who define the direction of this revolution. It's going to be the militarists now seizing back control, seizing back the initiative. And we'll see the political side of the movement from now on will begin to steadily lose ground, I say, to the militarists. So the conflict itself, as I say, it begins rather slowly. And I'll just show you here some of the phases of the conflict. I mean, really, to be frank, I mean, for the first 18 months, you wouldn't really even call this a war. It's not really a war in any sense. I mean, you know, I say Soloheadbeg's such a convenient date. I mean, had Soloheadbeg not happened, I think most historians would probably have plumped for a war which began maybe in the middle or later half of 1920. That's really when, you know, this begins to look a lot like a guerrilla war, where it really does appear you could paint this as a proper, more extensive guerrilla war. But I say there's a lot in this early phase. It's very, very low level stuff. So the shootings in South Tipperary, they don't actually, the Soloheadbeg thing doesn't actually start anything. You get the same general trend of escalation that you'd had, you know, from the summer of 1917. Same kind of thing. Low level, small scale acts of violence, and these isolated farms and all that, and these homes in rural Ireland. You certainly do, though, get more, I think, direct confrontation. Now, how do we explain that? Well, I suppose there's two parts to this. One is, of course, I suppose, an increasing boldness of the volunteers. So maybe the point is you go to the farmhouse and the guy says, no, I'm not giving you my gun. And you say, oh, come on, we need it for the fight for Irish freedom. Well, no, I need this. And it doesn't really go anywhere. Maybe that's what happened in the early stages. But I think now it's a case of give us it now. And, you know, we'll give him a smack. And I think that maybe they're getting more bold. Or, of course, on the other side, you could say there's more of a willingness now to resist these raids by their victims. Maybe the guy in the farm says, no, sorry, no, absolutely not. And fires a few shots in the air and things get a bit, you know, tasty and a bit violent. So I think that's maybe how we can kind of explain it. Shootings do begin, certainly in this period. So 6 policemen are killed in the first 6 months of the year. But again, activities largely focused on South Tipperary. You see this small group, down Breenshaw, Tracy and so on. Mayo and Limerick, there's bits and pieces here and there. And I'll show you here, actually. Here are some Crown forces, as we call them, which tends to be anyone really associated with the government, whether the RIC or the army or whatever. But, I mean, to give you an idea of the figures, and I say how this escalates, let me just tell you how many people, it's a very crude measure, but it does give you an idea of how this, I say, grows. In the whole of 1919, only 16 members of the Crown forces are killed. Sorry, only, but I say it's all relative. This is to rise then as the conflict kind of goes on. I mean, alarmingly at times. So 44 Crown forces are killed in the first 6 months of 1920. That rises then to 171 in the second half of 1920. And then in the first 6 months of 1921, the final 6 months of the war, that rises to 324. So the number of IRA casualties is a similar kind of escalation. So slightly lower overall, but that rises from 32 in the first half of 1920, 171 IRA deaths for the second half of that year, and then in that final 6 months, say in 1921, about 182 IRA victims. So again, similar kind of escalation. The official number of civilian deaths, and we've mentioned again, the tragedy about all this is so many civilians end up dying. More civilians die in the Irish Revolution than anyone else. The official number is around 900 civilians. Many of these also are in Belfast, of course, but although 3/4 of the civilian deaths, and this is interesting, die in the final 6 months. So, and what you can see is the conflict becomes increasingly bitter, it becomes a dirty war, and both sides, as it were, turn towards soft targets by targeting civilians. It's very, very sad. I mean, total amount of people die, 2,000, 2,300 people perhaps die in the War of Independence. So it's still significant. I'll show you here actually the point I make, if I can just put this little graph up here. There you go. You can see the percentage of civilians now, how it grows. So early on, you say it's still very significant, of course, but you can see now as it grows and grows and grows until you get, let's say in the first, let's say 6 months of 1922, after the treaty and so on, it's the vast majority of people being killed are civilians. So I say that's going to grow and grow. Now, I say they only really, though, of course, tell part of the story. If you look at deaths, and what increasingly we are finding out and we're realizing is that this is, beneath the, as it were, the headline figures, is a low-level campaign going on of woundings, of punishment beatings, of arson attacks and looting and expulsion and forced exile and all these dreadful kind of things. And of course, one book, a landmark study, which I think everyone, if you get a chance to read this, I've put a few chapters in the actual reading, but of course the work of Peter Hart, many years ago now, Peter wrote this book here, which really blew the lid off of all of this, The IRA and Its Enemies. That's another book there, collection of his articles, The IRA at War. But The IRA and Its Enemies is a very impactful book. And what he reveals is civilians, as I say, increasingly being targeted in this conflict. Not killed, as it were, by accident in the crossfire, but deliberately. And Hart looks at the IRA's enemies, a great title, isn't it? People that fall outside, as it were, the borders of the Irish nation and are targeted. So he looks, for example, at the experience of Southern Protestants being targeted by the IRA. He talks about travellers, anti-socials, so-called, vagrants and things, ex-British soldiers, all kinds of civilians. That's he reveals the real reality of this horrible, dirty war. Beneath all the songs and the national celebration and the films and all that stuff. And I say it's a wonderful book if you get a chance to read it. And, you realise, of course, that what happens in these kind of conflicts, and I'm assuming this happens everywhere, is most people just want it over. And most people just keep their heads down. And, don't really talk to anyone, either side, because you're going to end up being targeted. Now, as I say, the war is, in its early stages, is little more often these kind of unruly scuffles and things for arms, and the very rare shooting might happen here and there. But the British response to this, this increase in disorder, is very heavy-handed and will prove very, very counterproductive. And I'll show you here, these are the last two guys in charge now, the last two chief secretaries, the hardline, particularly Ian Macpherson, a pretty hardline character. And what they do, particularly Macpherson now, is to follow a policy of confrontation by the maintenance now of the Wartime Defence of the Realm Act, which allows for all kinds of things. I'll show you actually the Defence of the Realm Act here. As you can see, emergency legislation. It means the government can now basically arrest people off the street, suspension of habeas corpus, military tribunals, aggressive searches without warrants and so on. Yeah, it's all this way of, as it were, putting down, I suppose, a counterinsurgency kind of measure, but it's pretty harsh. And what happens is, it's almost like you imagine this kind of conflict gets, as it were, pushed on to its more, escalates as a reaction to what the British are doing. You imagine if the British hadn't been as heavy-handed as this, where would this conflict have gone? Would it have escalated as much as it did? So, for example, what happens is a British soldier is killed in Fermoy in East Cork, and the town then gets raided by the military. So they raid into the military looking for arms and so on. But the trouble is, this goes into people's houses. It affects their everyday lives. The British authorities, for example, outlaw the Doyle. The Doyle is outlawed in mid-September. So it's allowed to keep running, but now they're going to put the hammer down. They also proclaim large areas in the south and west of the country, put them under essentially martial law now. And the thing about this kind of thing is, I say it's, all nationalist organisations, including the Volunteers, Cumann and the Gaelic League, they end up being proclaimed in November of 1919. You have a series of kind of local county bans, but now it becomes a national kind of ban. And I say the problem is this crackdown is how crudely it's applied and its effect on everyday civilian life. So, local businesses start to be closed down. Parades, public gatherings, all kinds of activists have all nothing to do with the volunteers or violence are arrested and dragged off and, interrogated. With this martial law, you end up maybe not having your local market that you've had. This is kind of the lifeblood of the local economy. These kind of things are banned. So, and as you can see here, so it gets into everybody's life now, this kind of martial law. And I say, so it affects everybody now at all kinds of levels of Irish society. So not everyone is going to experience, as I say, violence and intimidation and all that stuff. But it's just this annoying kind of roadblocks and people open the boot and stuff and, you're on the bus and on the tram, so searching you and knocking on your door. We're conducting an investigation and, that's, as I say, that is really one thing that's going to cause, as I say, this whole thing to escalate more and more. Now, I say, so a British attempt at a crackdown is the first thing we get. But let's say the main focus of this war is going to be intensely local. And the main targets of the IRA, as they're beginning to be known now, are the RIC. So it's not the British Army, everything. It tends to be the RIC. And of course, they're very convenient targets, the RIC, because they represent state authority at local level. And most importantly with the RIC, when you think about it, they're from the local area. These guys, they went to school with these guys, many of these people. They've been there for years and they know everything about the little town. Or the villages. They know everything. They know every family. They know who the troublemakers are. They know absolutely everything. They're always watching out. So if you want to, the IRA want to, conduct some sort of covert campaign, these people are the eyes and ears, as it were, of the state, and they have to be kind of dealt with. And as I say, these people will be dealt with in their local communities. And I say this is why it has a kind of character of a civil war, if you like. A lot of mini civil wars, let's say, in these kind of areas. What they do firstly is they introduce an RIC boycott, which is kind of sad, really, because what it means is you have to now shun the RIC and their families in these local areas. So you don't want to be seen talking to them. And I say, you've grown up with these people. So they come into the shop, they're just ignored. You don't talk to them. They come to church, they don't talk to the kids, kind of get bullied at school and so on. To completely ostracize them now, isolate them completely. They're not to be trusted. The IRA are telling you that now. So, and you don't want to risk chatting to the RIC man. So these poor guys, as I say, have a terrible experience now. And what will happen is, as I said, they remain the principal target because of this local knowledge. And what will happen is they will get targeted increasingly. And of course, being ostracized, shot at, they become increasingly more ineffective. And a crucial decision is taken now, and that is particularly to abandon hundreds of small isolated village police stations to concentrate in the larger towns. So you've got these little police stations, which are very cute. If you ever go to Ireland, you still get this now, Garda station, often a little terraced house. There's 3 guys in it, whatever, for the village. And I say they know everybody and everyone knows them. But the point is, what good are they really doing out there? All they are really now is targets, essentially. So they make a decision now to withdraw them all, and these small little groups now, to larger towns where they can maybe act together. Now, what this will lead to is the first real coordinated national campaign, as it were, from the volunteers. And what they'll do is they move in now in the spring of 1920, and this is really a key moment, to burn these barracks that have been abandoned down. And this happens everywhere. Loads of these, hundreds of them now are burnt down, and everyone's doing this. Of course, so there's no one in these. They've all been left open. But the point is, you see, you want to stop the police coming back and using these as now a new, maybe send the army in or something and use them. So this is a way of, I say, that the reoccupation at a later date is not going to happen. And this is often the first thing that the IRA will, that many IRA members will do, is go to them, burn the local barracks down. You know, and there's some wonderful stories about how incredibly incompetent they are in terms of doing it. Some of them set fire to the wrong house and stuff, someone else's house, and he comes home, oh, we were trying to burn that one, and they put the bombs in the wrong places and blow the wrong walls out and stuff. But so across now in the spring of 1920, you know, if you want a big headline moment which signals this campaign's ratcheting up, huge burning of hundreds of barracks now in local areas across the country. So I say that's going to be the early part of this. Now, the war itself, as I say, the thing about the war, and just to mention, I suppose, the issue of what we might call the geography of revolution. I'll show you a map here, just so we know where we're talking about. The war is very piecemeal and patchy, and I can't emphasise that enough. In the sense that most parts of Ireland experience very little or no violence at all. You know, I'd say it's very regional. The war itself, if you talk about something that looks, as I say, like a war with ambushes and large scale kind of IRA, active IRA volunteer companies and so on, is mainly a Munster affair. Munster is the place where the real heavy stuff is. South Tipperary, particularly Cork, is the most violent county in Ireland in terms of deaths and violence and so on. Of course, the most violent place in all of Ireland during the revolutionary period is Belfast, and that's often forgotten. With 450 people or something losing their lives in Belfast, but we'll talk about that obviously in a separate section. But you know, if you are being absolutely objective and you want to look for violence in Ireland in this period, you know, you look at Belfast. And that raises, I'd say, this issue of having a holistic kind of view of Ireland during this period, and I think you definitely need to do this. But if we look at the counties, for example, so a few other counties, as I say, we do have short, sporadic, intense periods of violence, maybe better way to put it. So you get, I say in Longford, you get an explosion of violence. It doesn't last very long, and then it all goes quiet. Donegal's the same. Bits in Monaghan don't last long at all. And the question often is, we'll talk about Dublin next time, because Dublin's slightly different with Michael Collins and so on. But, a Dublin and Munster affair is probably a way to summarise this, this conflict. And the question obviously is, which always vexes historians, is why in some places and not others? Why is it happen more in Cork and it doesn't happen as much in Roscommon or whatever? Why? Again, look, there are various explanations being put forward over the years, none of them really satisfactory. One argument always was the suitability of local terrain for guerrilla fighting. So there's lots of hills and things. You go to Kerry or something, it's got mountains and stuff, it's great. And yeah, that could explain it. That's how it doesn't really work, that as a blanket kind of explanation. Because to say, if you look at Longford, you ever been to Longford? Longford's like a billiard table. It's flat as a pancake. There's no hills in Longford. So, that doesn't work as a catch-all kind of explanation. Some have said the county's history of radical political activity. Maybe. That doesn't really work when you look at all these different counties. I think the main argument, the one that works for me, you may disagree, but the one that always works for me is local leadership. I think it depends on who the warlord, as it were, is in your area. They're the ones who are setting the dynamism for this movement. And as I said, when you get to a point where, when they capture the big guy, as it were, the leader, when he's captured, Longford's a great example of that. When Sean McKeon's captured, quiet. That's it. It all goes very quiet. So these are pivotal figures. I think that's very, very important. There's also, of course, the case that, in some counties, they're taking time to get up to speed. And I mentioned Sligo as an example of that. And here's Michael Farry's book here. A very interesting book about Sligo. And they're taking time, as it were, to, to develop their volunteer organisation, to get weapons, to train people, and so on. So something like Sligo, for example, virtually nothing happens during the War of Independence. Although we know there's volunteer activity, but it's nothing like you get in Munster. But when the Civil War comes, Sligo's a madhouse. It's crazy. And I think that's because there's different tracks here. It takes a while to get people, as it were, to get the weapons and get everything trained and get ready for action. It's almost by the time you're ready for action in Sligo, the war's over. Right, okay. But when the Civil War comes, then you're ready to go. But again, that's just one of these kind of interesting kind of questions of why some places than others. And I say even the explanation of leadership doesn't totally work. But I say Munster and Dublin. And just to mention Dublin, just a final point today, of course, to lead on to what we'll talk about next time. The other major centre of the war, I say Belfast we'll talk about separately, is the conflict particularly is going to revolve, of course, around the activities of Michael Collins and his small band of elite hand-picked volunteers. And we'll talk about Collins. What Collins is going to be doing in this war is going to be very different from what is going on in the provinces. And so that's a different type of war. As we'll see, it's an intelligence war. It's a war of assassination. And so, I say, that's what we'll talk about next time, the Dublin part of this conflict. And we'll particularly focus on Michael Collins and the figure of Collins and the myth of Collins that develops during this war. Okay, everyone, so I'll see you all very soon. Take care.